The tithing theology your church teaches has exactly one problem. It stops at verse 10. Malachi 3 verse 10 is the most cited verse in sermons about money throughout the Christian world. What no one cites is what comes before, what comes after, and for whom that text was originally written. When you read the entire document, the narrative changes completely. It puts what is at stake here into the right perspective. Brazil has, according to the 2018 IBGE census, approximately 169 million people who declare themselves Christians, a number that represents about 86% of the country's total population. Within this group, more than 42 million identify as evangelicals, and more than 21 million specifically as members of Pentecostais and Neo-Pentecostais churches. These are communities present in all 26 states and the Distrito Federal, in every city with more than 5,000 inhabitants, in practically all peripheral neighborhoods of the country's large metropolises. And in practically all these communities, every week without exception, the same verse is read aloud into the microphone. The same promise is made. The same threat is activated. The Brazilian religious market moves more than 60 billion reais per year. This number is not a generous estimate. It appears in surveys by the Fundação Getúlio Vargas and in religious economy sector reports published by independent institutes. 60 billion. And the largest slice of this value is sustained by a single doctrinal mechanism, the mandatory nature of the tithe as a current spiritual law, built upon 3 verses of the Old Testament, read every week to workers, retirees, single mothers, and the unemployed who believe they are in debt to Deus if the monthly envelope remains incomplete. 3 verses. The Biblia has 66 books, 1,189 chapters, 31,102 verses in total. The largest private collection structure in the history of Brazil was built on the reading of 3 of these verses, extracted from the context of the other 31,099. This deserves to be investigated with precision. Tithing was not invented by Cristianismo. This is the first piece of data the document makes clear when you read it without cuts. The practice of setting aside a tenth of production as an offering or tribute predates the Hebrew Biblia by at least 2,000 years. Assyrian cuneiform records from the 3rd millennium before Christo already document decimal taxation systems destined for temples and regional power structures. The Hebrew word maaser, which literally means 1 of 10, appears for the first time in the biblical text in Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. Abraham has just returned from a victorious battle against 4 allied kings and offers a tenth of the spoils of war to Melchizedek, priest-king of Salem, a unique, spontaneous transaction without explicit divine instruction, without a command for future repetition. The second occurrence is in Genesis chapter 28, verse 22. Jacob, fleeing from his brother Esau after stealing his father's blessing, makes a personal vow. If Deus protects him on the journey and brings him back safe and sound, he will give back a tenth of everything he receives. Also an individual vow. Also without a basis in universal legislation. Systematic legislation appears only in the books of Levitico and Numeros, written within the specific context of the Constitution of Israel as a national theocracy after the Exodus from Egypt. And when you read this legislation without interruption, not the snippet of 3 verses that circulates in Sunday sermons, but the complete text with all its chapters and recipients, what you find is not one system. They are 3 completely different systems with distinct recipients, distinct purposes, and operational structures that have nothing to do with what is taught as tithing in Sunday services. 3 systems, 3 purposes, 3 recipients. The first tithe is in Levitico chapter 27, verses 30 to 33, confirmed in Numeros chapter 18, verses 21 to 24. It was intended exclusively for the tribe of Levi, the only one of the 12 tribes of Israel that did not receive a territorial inheritance when the people settled in Canaan. The Levites were the priestly and administrative structure of the Israelite theocracy. With no land to cultivate, no rural property to generate a livelihood, they depended on the tithe as institutional remuneration. It was paid in agricultural produce, grain, wine, oil, fruits of the earth. Livestock entered only by a specific counting criterion, every 10th animal that passed under the staff. Money was not mentioned at any point in this legislation. It wasn't a metaphor, it was food. The second tithe is in Deuteronomy, chapter 14, verses 22 to 27. It was set aside by the Israelita himself to be consumed by him and his family during the annual festivals in Jerusalem. The text is specific. The Israelita was to take it to the place Deus chose, and there spend it on oxen, sheep, wine, and strong drink, and whatever his soul desired. If the distance was too great, the law permitted converting everything into money and spending it in Jerusalem during the festival. Observe what this means. The second tithe was for you to celebrate. The third tithe is in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 and 29. It was not annual. It was collected only in the 3rd and 6th years of each 7-year cycle, and it was not destined for the temple or the priests of Jerusalem. It was explicitly destined for the local Levita, the resident foreigner, the widow without legal protection, and the orphan without family support. It was a social redistribution fund, a protection mechanism for the most vulnerable in the Israelite structure. Now you have the complete picture. 3 systems, 3 logics, 3 recipients, none of them structured as a fixed percentage of 10% of monthly monetary income, paid regularly to a religious organization that demands it as a condition for divine blessing. Scale the geopolitical context in which this legislation existed. Israel was a national theocracy with no functional separation between civil government and religious structure. The Levitical priesthood simultaneously exercised the functions of clergy, judiciary, educational system, and the administrative apparatus of the state. The Temple of Jerusalem functioned as a central bank, Ministry of Finance, and public assistance system, all integrated into a single structure. The tithe was not a voluntary offering of personal devotion. It was a compulsory tribute to sustain the functioning of a theocratic government in a nation without a separate secular administration. This is not a progressive theological interpretation. It is the history of public administration in the ancient Oriente Medio. The same understanding present in the main dictionaries of biblical theology published by conservative seminaries in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Alemania. And it is precisely in this context that you need to read Malachias. The book of Malachias was composed approximately between 450 and 430 years before Christo, in the late post-exilic period. Israel had returned from Babylonia after 70 years of captivity. The temple had been rebuilt under the supervision of the Imperio Persa, but the priesthood that had resumed its functions was deeply corrupted. The priests accepted blind, lame, and sick animals as sacrifices, the exact equivalent of receiving fraudulent payments into the temple treasury. They diverted resources that should have reached widows and orphans. They neglected the instruction of the law they were institutionally paid to teach. Malachias is a formal accusation against this priesthood. Malachias chapter 1, verse 6. To you, O sacerdotes, who despise my name. Malachias chapter 2, verse 1. This commandment is for you, O sacerdotes. Malachias chapter 2, verse 8. But you have turned from the way and caused many to stumble at the law. Malachias chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. For he is like a refiner's fire. He will purify the sons of Levi. 4 chapters. 3 of them explicitly addressed to the corrupt priesthood of Jerusalem. When you reach Malachias, chapter 3, verse 8, "Will a man rob Deus? Yet you have robbed me. And you say, in what have we robbed you? In tithes and offerings." The pronoun you is not pointing to the Israelita peasant who could not pay. It is pointing to the Leviticus priests who intercepted the tithes before they reached the temple treasury, who diverted the resources destined for foreigners, widows, and orphans, who corrupted precisely the redistributive mechanism that the law had created to protect the most vulnerable. Verse 10, "Bring all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house," is an imperative directed at the corrupt priestly clergy of the 5th century before Christo to stop defrauding the redistribution system that the law had established. It is a restitution order addressed to dishonest institutional administrators. The text does not lie. The snippet lies. The most cited verse in sermons about tithing in the entire world was written to denounce priests who diverted resources from the poor, not to collect tithes from the people. If this is written with such clarity in the document that the churches claim to follow, if the historical context, the explicit recipients, and the internal logic of the book all point in the same direction, how did this specific reading, which completely inverts the original meaning, become the financial foundation for tens of millions of Brazilian families? The Novo Testamento, the 27 books that make up the second half of the Christian document, does not instruct any community in any era to pay tithes. The word appears exactly 8 times in the entire New Testament corpus. In 3 passages, Jesus mentions tithing to criticize Pharisees who measured dill, cumin, and mint with religious precision while neglecting justice, mercy, and faith. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law." The other 5 mentions are concentrated in Hebrews chapter 7, in a theological argument that uses the episode of Abraham and Melchizedek to demonstrate precisely that the Levitico priesthood, the structure that gave meaning and function to the tithe, was superseded and ended in Christo. The text that many use to contextualize tithing ends by arguing that the system that produced the tithe was abolished. 8 mentions. No instruction for Christians to pay tithes. Paulo wrote 14 letters recognized by the Protestant canon. He addressed finances, voluntary contributions, and the support of leaders in at least 6 of them. In none of these 14 letters does Paulo use the word tithe to instruct a Christian community on how to contribute financially. The most extensive instruction he left on ecclesiastical finances occupies 2 entire chapters, 2 Corinthians, chapter 8 and chapter 9. The organizing principle is in chapter 9, verse 7. Each one should give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for Deus loves a cheerful giver. Not reluctantly, not under compulsion. Paulo was a trained rabbi, a student of Gamaliel, one of the most respected religious jurists of the 1st century. He knew the Mosaic law deeply enough to debate with authority in any Sanhedrin of the Mediterranean. In 22 years of documented missionary activity in communities spread across at least 6 regions of the Imperio Romano, he did not instruct tithing in any letter. This absence is not a gap. It is a deliberate theological position. So how did mandatory tithing enter Christianismo? The answer lies in institutional history and has much more to do with funding needs than with apostolic revelation. The first centuries of Christianismo did not know tithing as an established practice. The Didache, one of the oldest Christian texts outside the canon, dated from approximately 100 to 150 after Christo, describes contribution practices based on generosity and the personal discernment of each believer. No fixed percentage, No language of obligation, no threat for non-payment. 100 years of documented Christian history. Zero mention of tithing as current law. The Concilio de Macon, in the year 585 after Christo, was the first Western ecclesiastical council to declare the obligation of tithing for all Christians in Europa, threatening non-payers with excommunication. 485 years of Christian history passed before tithing was declared ecclesiastical law with a formal penalty. And the declaration came from a regional council of bishops with clear institutional interests, not from an apostle with revealed instruction. The decisive transformation came with Carlos Magno. In the year 779, the Capitulare Haristalense transformed the tithe into mandatory civil law in the territories of the Sacro Imperio Romano-Germanico. Any farmer who did not pay the tithe to the church was subject to punishments applied by the secular state. Tithing ceased to be a theological issue and became a fiscal instrument of a political power that used the church as an apparatus for territorial legitimation. Mandatory tithing was a law of Carlos Magno, not an apostolic instruction. This structure was questioned by the Protestant Reformation of the 16th and 17th centuries, when Calvino, Lutero, and the Reformers concluded that the Levitico tithe had been ended with the new covenant in Christo. Most Reformed denominations abandoned mandatory tithing as binding law. It was reintroduced as a current spiritual law, mainly in North American Pentecostalism at the beginning of the 20th century, by the movement that emerged from 1906. It was this model that arrived in Brazil. The entry of Neo-Pentecostalismo into Brazil happened with force starting in the 70s, but it was in the 80s and 90s that the model took its definitive institutional form. Television was the main vector. Denominations that invested in time slots on national broadcast networks, costs in the range of tens of thousands of dollars monthly per network, needed a collection structure that would sustain growth. Prosperity theology, imported from the North American matrix of the Word of Faith movement, provided the doctrinal architecture. The formula has three elements that reinforce each other with mechanical precision. The first, the tithe is a current divine law, mandatory for all Christians of all times, without historical exception. The second, payment activates the promise of Malachi 3 verse 10, supernatural financial blessing, windows of heaven opened. The third, non-payment activates the curse of verse 9, you are cursed with a curse, and explains any and all financial or family adversity the believer may be going through. The logic closes in such a way that there is no exit through empirical evidence. If you paid and things improved, the system works. If you paid and things did not improve, there is some other sin blocking the blessing. If you did not pay and things got worse, it is the curse. If you did not pay and things improved, it is provisional grace that will run out. The argument is structurally impermeable to any counterexample. It is a perfect logical trap. How can a doctrinal structure refuted by the very text it cites as its basis remain intact for more than 40 years, taught without public challenge in tens of thousands of churches to tens of millions of people? The answer has two parts. The first part is psychological. The language of the curse operates at the deepest level of human vulnerability, the fear of divine punishment. When someone believes that Deus can curse them for not paying a specific percentage of their income, economic rationality does not compete with the emotional weight of that belief. The relief that comes from payment, even when the financial situation does not improve, is real. Because it is the relief from guilt that was methodically induced and then provisionally removed. The classic mechanism: create the anxiety, provide the relief, condition the behavior. The Datafolha Institute published a survey in 2022 showing that approximately 56% of Brazilian evangelicals who declare they pay tithes regularly earn up to 2 monthly minimum wages. The highest rate of tithing compliance is in the lowest income bracket. It is not a statistical coincidence. It is the predictable result of a mechanism that works best where emotional vulnerability is greatest and access to specialized theological information is lowest. The second part is institutional. A denomination with 10 million regular tithing members and an average income of 2 minimum wages moves, by a conservative estimate, more than 8 billion reais per year in contributions. No organization of this size has an organic incentive to question the doctrine that finances its existence. Pastors whose livelihood depends on tithing collections do not have the institutional comfort to preach against it. And members who have spent 20 or 30 years paying do not have the psychological ease to accept that the cost they paid was unnecessary. The system self-regulates silence. It is simply the institutional physics of organizations financially dependent on a single doctrine. Follow the concrete human cost of what is being described here, not the theological cost, the cost in real lives. A Brazilian evangelica family from the interior of the Nordeste, with a monthly family income of 2,200 reais, 2 dependent children, and 2 adults in the informal sector, who have paid tithes regularly for 15 years, has handed over approximately 39,600 reais to their denomination during that period. This same amount, invested in a fixed income fund with an average annual yield of 6%, would represent more than 63,000 reais today, an amount sufficient to provide the down payment for home financing through the Minha Casa Minha Vida program in most cities in the Brazilian Nordeste. It is not abstract. It is the house that this family did not build. Field research conducted by researchers from the Departamento de Antropologia da Universidade de São Paulo documents families that keep their tithes up to date even during periods of prolonged unemployment, resorting to revolving credit with interest rates of 12% per month, 336% per year to cover basic expenses while the envelope remains intact. These are testimonies from women who hide credit card debts from their husbands but do not hide the tithing receipt. From retirees who reduce the dosage of continuous use medications but do not reduce their monthly contribution. From young people who postpone training projects but do not delay the envelope. The system does not fail those who administer it, it fails those who feed it. And the mechanism that ensures this failure is never named as such is exactly the language of spiritual guilt. When things do not improve even while paying, it is because there is another debt to Deus that needs to be resolved. The doctrine possesses a mechanism for attributing responsibility to the payer that makes it immune to any contrary evidence. It is structurally perfect as an instrument of control, and structurally devastating as a financial policy for low-income families. Observe what conservative theologians themselves, those who believe in the full authority of the Biblia and have no religious deconstruction agenda, have recorded on this subject within the very institutions that teach tithing. The Baptist theologian Russell Earl Kelly published a systematic 366-page study in 2002 examining every occurrence of words related to tithing in the original biblical texts in Hebrew and Greek. Kelly's conclusion, after 20 years of research conducted within a conservative tradition, is documented. The Old Testament tithe was a specific tax system for the Israelite theocracy, which was never transferred to the Novo Testamento as a Christian obligation, and its current imposition represents a distortion of the document the churches claim to follow. Kelly lost his job as a pastor for publishing this research. The theologian Craig Blomberg, a professor at Denver Seminary, a conservative evangelical institution among the most respected in the United States, published in 2006, that the Novo Testamento does not support tithing as a legal obligation for Christians, and that the financial practice of the early Christian community was based on proportional generosity, not on a universal fixed percentage with the threat of non-payment. These are not liberal theologians. They are the same authors cited in the reference libraries and curricula of the seminaries of the denominations that teach mandatory tithing every Sunday. The debate is not between believers and skeptics. It is between those who have read the entire document and those who stopped at verse 10. Put into perspective what the three lies of the title represent when you have the full picture. The first lie is that the tithe is a universal law for all Christians of all times. The document shows that it was specific taxation for a national theocracy without a secular state, destined for a priesthood without a land inheritance, operating in a pre-monetary economy of agricultural products. This theocracy ended its historical function with the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70 after Christo, 1956 years ago. The three institutional pillars that gave meaning to the tithe were removed when 4 Roman legions under the command of General Tito, with approximately 24,000 soldiers, destroyed Jerusalem in August of the year 70. There is no Levitico priesthood, there is no temple. The structure died 2 millennia ago. The second lie is that Malachi 3 verse 10 is a personal promise addressed to you who pay the tithe. The document shows that it is an imperative directed at corrupt priests of a specific city in the 5th century before Christo, so that they would stop diverting resources intended for the poor. The promise of the windows of heaven was linked to a specific institutional restitution that has no functional relationship with a bank deposit made on the 10th of each month. The third lie is the most serious, that you are cursed if you do not pay. Malachi chapter 3 verse 9. You are cursed with a curse, for you are robbing me, even this whole nation, is explicitly addressed to the priests of Jerusalem, who diverted the resources intended for widows, orphans, and foreigners. If anyone was robbing Deus in that text, it was not the Israelite peasant unable to pay. It was the priest with access to the treasury and with dishonest hands. The curse was transplanted. The original recipient was left behind. And when you realize that the spiritual guilt you carried for not being able to pay the tithe in a month of accumulated debt, in a period of unemployment, in a year of illness in the family, when you realize that this guilt was induced by a reading that inverts the original meaning of the text presented as an absolute foundation, the weight of this is not just theological, it is personal, it is historical, it is real. In the Palestina of the 5th century before Christo, the priests of the Temple of Jerusalem used the law of the tithe to maintain a religious structure that served, above all, itself. It was exactly against this that Malachi wrote, not against the people who did not pay, but against the priests who diverted. The text that your church uses every week to collect was originally written to denounce those who collected wrongly. 2,400 years later, with live streaming, donation apps, PICs, and credit cards, the pattern is the same. A selective reading of an ancient text, separated from the context that originated it, repeated with enough authority so that no one asks where it came from. History hasn't moved forward, it just changed microphones.